Hei og velkommen til en ny dag av internettdagene. Vi fortsetter på engelsk. We continue in English because we have an exciting guest from the US together with us. And my name is Morten Myrstad in the new company. And the topic of today is audio. And it's rather exciting to think about audio these days because I think there's about 1 million podcasters in the world. And soon maybe everybody is a podcaster, but maybe not as easy as being a TikToker or a YouTuber or whatever. And we have also had this social audio explosion this year with Clubhouse, with Twitter Spaces, but now also with Facebook and Spotify. And of course, we then ask the question, what about the workplace? What will happen on the workplace? And therefore, we are really, really excited to welcome Molly Beck to our to this webinar. And she will explain to us what is the trends, why you should do a podcast internally in the company, and also how you can do it. So welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much. I am just so delighted to be here today. I've never spoken to an international audience before, so I'm excited. I can't wait to be in community with all of you. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope this presentation is enormously helpful to everyone watching.
Thank you, Molly. And Molly is then the CEO of a company which is called Messy FM. She will probably herself explain the name. And she has former experience from business podcasting in Forbes. And Messy is a platform for internal podcasting. But I will then give the word to Messy, and here you go.
Wonderful. So today we're talking about how to start an internal podcast for your organization. This presentation will run for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have lots of questions. I want you to leave this conversation, whether you're watching it live or pre-recorded, with all of the questions about how to start an internal podcast at your organization answered. As I was introduced, my name is Molly Beck. I'm from Messy FM. We do software and content for internal podcasts. I'm so passionate about the audio space, social audio. I'm sure we'll get into that. And let's get started. So I like to level set these conversations. I know people come into podcasting conversations on sort of different backgrounds. Some people might be voracious podcast listeners now. Some people might be just jumping into the space. But just so we're on the same page, what podcasting is it's basically a radio show. You can listen to it anytime over the internet. The medium's been around for coming up on 20 years. In the US, Serial was a seminal show. It came out about 6 years ago, and that's really when podcasting became mainstream. One of the reasons people call podcasting the democratization of radio is because it's easy for individual creators to think of a show idea, record it, edit it, and then push it out on publicly available platforms. So we're talking today about internal private podcasts. So a public podcast is typically what we think of when we think of podcasts. A public podcast is available for anyone to access. It's searchable on major directories like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. And on the flip side, we have private podcasts. Private podcasts is created the same way a public podcast is. You record audio, you edit that audio, you add in some music. The difference is the podcast is only available for a limited audience. So today we're talking about internal podcasts. Those are private podcasts only available for members of a company or organization, and they're typically accessed through the company's intranet, through a white labeled app, or behind a password. So with that on board, let's talk about internal podcasts. Why would a company be interested in starting an internal podcast? In general, there's sort of four main reasons that when I talk to someone that is interested in starting, they're either interested because they have an executive team that doesn't know their employees. Maybe they have hundreds, thousands of employees that all wrap up into an executive that's not going to have time for a one-on-one conversation with every single person that reports into them up the chain of command. So an internal podcast can scale that executive's visibility among the organization. We also see internal podcasts being really popular for team collaboration. What that means is if I'm in one department and you're in another, we might not intersect in our work life. We might not be on the same emails, but having a podcast that can either bring us together, we can be interviewed together, we can both be listening to the same show. It's a way to improve the flow of communication inside an organization, especially important because 3 out of 4 employees say that they're routinely missing out on company news. Another big reason for starting an internal podcast is internal podcasts are fun. They can make things like training or rewatching a video replay or just engaging with company content really fun and exciting. 1 in 2 Americans listen to podcasts. That number is growing all over the world. If you have a workforce that's multinational, some people in the US, some people in other countries, being able to have content that is time zone agnostic, that is streams faster than video. Audio is wonderful because it streams faster than video, so you jump over latency concerns. And it's just something that's new and exciting. And if you're an internal communications manager, you are always looking for ways to reach employees that are new and exciting. And lastly, internal podcasts really can add nuance and humanization for important conversations. Sometimes things get lost in text. It's harder to be funny or engaging or charming in email. And not everybody wants to be on video. Not everybody feels comfortable being on video. So audio is this sweet spot where it's really easy to consume, also really easy to create. What we see over here at Messy is really the rise of workplace infotainment. We consider this to be async, curated content that supports ongoing internal priorities. There will always be a place in work for execution-based content. That would be email, that would be Slack or Microsoft Teams messages. What's going on with the meeting today? Did you get that report? What's the update? We need it by end of day today. There's always a place for content that is very useful in the moment, but looking at an email from a month ago is typically not that helpful. We see podcasts as filling in this gap of content that whether you listen to it today or listen to it 6 months from now, it's answering some questions about your organization. Popular use cases we see for internal podcasts are around, number 1, repurposing internal communications into audio. So if you have company newsletters, quarterly meetings, virtual town halls, taking that same content and putting it into an audio format, either by reading out loud a newsletter with some funny interjections, taking a video meeting and turning it into a podcast by just stripping out the visuals. Anything that you can add podcasting to this internal communications wheel is a really popular use case. We also see a lot of audio around knowledge sharing. And so thinking about training, onboarding, pushing out new information about competitive landscape or product updates. Knowledge sharing is a huge use case around internal podcasts. We mentioned executive visibility on the last couple of slides. That's a use case where making sure you're scaling an executive's time. The reason that we all think that we are best friends with our favorite podcasters is because we're listening on our own time, in our own environment. We're imagining that we're eavesdropping on a conversation. You can have that same feeling when you're listening to an executive of a company with the benefit of it being private, secure, internal, so competitors or potential clients or current customers can't hear it. And the last use case that we see is around deskless workers. These are people that are potentially driving. They have lots of what we call windshield time. Maybe they're working in a factory or they're in a medical community where they're on their feet a lot. Not everybody has access to desktops or even their mobile phone for reading their eyes all day long and being able to push out internal content that is in an audio format, screen-free, time zone agnostic, easy to stream in low latency environments. That's where podcasting fits in. So you might be thinking like, okay, who at my organization should be hosting our internal podcast? So we usually see podcasts that are company-wide are typically done by an internal communications team. They're already responsible for reaching swaths of employees, and they want to add that content into audio. Typically, internal communications teams, manager of internal comms, director, someone that's already managing the intranet content, are also adding in podcasts. And then we also see department-wide podcasts. So these are podcasts that are typically done by functional leaders, people that are managing just the marketing, just the finance, just the sales organization. And one of the nice things about internal podcasts is that you can parse the distribution of the podcast based on any information that's held in your identity management platform. So you can have podcasts that only go out to specific groups on employees based on their department, their manager, their employee resource group. You can make it so that typically when we talk about internal podcasts, we're not talking about one podcast going out to the whole company. We're talking about a company starting 20, 25, 30 podcasts, and maybe 5 or 6 are company-wide, and the rest are specific to different groups of individuals. It's like a personal Apple podcast for every employee, typically accessible through their intranet. So let's talk about something fun, different show formats. So whether a show is publicly available or privately available, we typically see shows breaking down around 3 formats. This is more of an art than a science. Some shows might be a bit in a gray area, but we do typically see host-driven shows, subject matter experts sharing that knowledge, guest-driven, highlighting guests to a wider audience, or storyline-driven, exploring a topic, doing a deep dive through a more journalistic lens. So let's look at some examples for internal podcasts that are these different types of categories. For host-driven internal podcasts, examples, and I think that just want to call this out, these would be great slides to screenshot or take a picture of and get some of the ideas going for what could my organization do in internal podcasts. So if you're interested in host-driven, example of host-driven shows would be a C-suite executive doing an ongoing Ask Me Anything series for employees. Employees submit questions. The executive chooses 2 or 3 to answer in each podcast. The questions could be about work. They could be about the executive's career journey. They could be advice-driven. Really easy way to create a show that, again, scales an executive's time and helps employees feel more engaged at work. We also see team leaders doing a behind the scenes of a product launch or pulling back the curtain of what their department is doing for the wider org. Love it when I see companies doing something to do a getting to know me series with a key new hire. So if you bring in someone from the outside to manage a large department, large group, having them do a podcast, people can get to know them better. It doesn't have to be super long. It could be like a 6-episode series, really easy way to scale their time. And then of course, onboarding and training. This is a use case we see very frequently, which is the CEO, sometimes board of directors, but someone very high up in the organization does a welcome to our company podcast for new hires, covering company history, company values, welcome to the team. You know, in those first couple of days of an organization, you typically don't have a ton of work to do. So having some really cool audio content while you're, filling out direct deposit forms is a really nice way to welcome someone to the team. So let's look at guest-driven internal podcasts. A guest-driven podcast would be highlighting guests to a wider audience inside an organization that might look like HR, interviewing high-performing team members. The Employee of the Month plaque on the wall is dead. The Employee of the Month podcast is a super easy way to help employees feel real special, valued. You could have bosses submit employees that have done a great job on recent projects. Really easy, inexpensive way to help employees feel super valued. Also see lots of marketing teams doing a stakeholder series where they interview stakeholders, whether that's customers along the supply chain, talking about, hey, here's what our customers are doing, the challenges they face, and then scaling that across the organization, especially for groups that are not regularly interfacing with customers. This was a big one during COVID, and I think it will continue ongoing. This would be events team, bringing in thought leaders, bringing in people from the outside and having them talk about specific challenges to the organization. Again, you want to lean into the fact that internal podcasts are private only available for people that work at the company, so you don't have to worry about competitors or potential clients listening to this content. So having someone that's a thought leader in your space come in and really talk about specific challenges to your organization, scaling that in audio, easy way to do that. And then, of course, going back to interviewing members of the team and getting to know our format. Last example of an internal podcast would be a storyline-driven internal podcast. This is typically looking at a topic through a journalistic lens. The best example that I have here is research teams who maybe previously came out with like a very thick PDF, or they did a webinar that nobody really attended. You can take that exact same content and turn it into, you could splice it up, add in some music, maybe add in some jokes or some really interesting sort of behind the scenes information, and share that with the team. Again, workplace infotainment is content that is valuable today, but if someone joins the team in 3 months or 6 months, they can still go back and get a lot out of the audio content. This is a perfect example of content that's helpful today, helpful later on. So you might be thinking, okay, I have a bit of an idea for a show. How do I plan out specific episodes? My number one tip, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, is to think in seasons. So typically, a season of a podcast is between 8 and 12 episodes. It is really hard to plan out a show when you don't know how many episodes you're doing. But if you know you're doing 8 episodes and you know you want to do a mix of, maybe you want to do some interview, maybe you want to do some Ask Me Anything, and maybe you want to take 3 videos and turn them into audio, well, then there you go. You can plan that out. You can think about, okay, if we do this that week, then this would be a great follow-up the next week. If you think in seasons, it's just so much easier than I have to come up with a new episode every single Tuesday from now until forever. At the end of your first season, you can either roll right into the next season. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening to season 1 of my internal podcast. Be back next week for season 2. Or if your department's gotten busy or you have other things pulling at you, you can take a break in between seasons, and structuring it as season 1, then season 2 gives you that space without feeling like you're letting down or quitting on the podcast. Again, planning a season at once is going to help you with time management because you're going to know ahead of time what's coming down. And you also want to be posting consistently. So the same way that a publicly available podcast typically comes out on the same day every week, you want to do the same thing in a private audience podcast. So the best days for a podcast to come out would be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings. You want to schedule the podcast ideally to come out at midnight. And then when employees are coming into work or commuting, getting up in the morning, they can listen to the content as they're getting ready for the day. How do you name your internal podcast? So there's 2 ways that you can name it. I have a preference. The first one is just descriptive, the latest from the marketing group, the latest from executive's name, just a descriptive way to describe a podcast. But I think it's really fun, since it is internal, since it's not customer facing, do something that's a little inside jokey, something that other members of your team would laugh at or smile at, something that reinforces the idea that we're all a community here. I really think leaning into this idea that, like, hey, we're having some fun here. This is not facing our competitors. This is not facing our clients. This is us enjoying creating audio content, and doing something that's a bit more of like a wink and a nod is a really fun way to name your internal show. Sets people off on an excited foot. Okay, so we have your show concept. We have your show name. Now it's time to record. So here are the recording best practices. I make 2 equipment recommendations inside this conversation. The first is, if you're primarily doing remote recording, I recommend the ATR 2100. I actually have one right here that I'm talking into. It's about $60 USD on Amazon. It's a great microphone. In addition, if you're also interested in interviewing people in person as well, the Blue Yeti microphone, which is about $120 USD on Amazon, is a great option. I also have several Blue Yetis. In general, I really want to emphasize that it's not great to get super caught up in, we need the best microphone and we need all of these things that will be perfect. One of the reasons that my company Messy is called Messy FM is because we think that the future of audio is more social audio. And it's okay if you're not in a sound studio with millions of producers massaging the audio. This is about getting your voice out to an internal audience. In addition, you also want to think about location. So the smallest room that you can get into, conference rooms are great. If you have a smaller office, this is maybe one time where if you have a smaller office, you're actually at a benefit. And then you also want to add some what we call plush, or it could be pillows around the computer to box in the sound. So you'll see that's actually my desk setup. You'll see that there's my desktop, my microphone. I have an isolation shield, which I bought off Amazon. You just Google isolation shield, not needed. I do have one. And then I added some pillows right behind it. Is this totally needed? No, but will it help your sound just a little bit better? Yes. So let's talk about editing. You've recorded this audio and now it's time to edit. Editing is where podcasts go to die. That's where people get so excited about podcasting. They do all these things and then they record for 2 hours and tell themselves, oh, I'm just going to edit it down for a half hour later. No, that never works. It's extremely hard to edit content in a really fluid, interesting way. What you want to do with editing is you want to have your episode be really tight up front. So what that means is thinking ahead of time, okay, I want my show to be an average podcast, an internal podcast, at least on Messy FM, is 32 minutes long. So most podcasts are around a half hour. So you think, okay, around 28 minutes, I want to start wrapping up. And you have that number in your head the whole time. You tell it to your guest, you're watching the clock. Ideally, the episode that you record is the episode you want to push live. Maybe you cut out if the dog goes crazy for the doorbell or if really someone tells a story that you don't want to get out. But in general, the least amount of editing that you can do, the better. If you do have a guest on and the guest maybe you think is nervous, do a pre-interview with them. Ask them to run through their stories, have your talking points ready. And then one thing I always caution people is don't send over a list of questions for your guest to answer. Instead, ask your guest to come prepared with 3 stories, a story about X, a story about Y, and a story about Z. If they come prepared with stories, it's much more interesting for the audience. And then you get away from this. Sometimes when we ask people for advice, it's overly prepared and more generic, where a story is more personable. You want to lean into the fact that audio is a really intimate medium and have people telling stories, not just advice. Okay, you have these shows out there. Now it's time to start marketing your show internally. As a reminder, the way people access internal shows is 3 ways, either through their employee intranet, through a white labeled app, or through a password protected page. So when it's time to market, you want to think about who can we market our show to internally? How can we get a wider reach, even if it's just a wider reach within your department? And the way that you do that is by being really strategic about guests. So you want to think about who's somebody inside my organization that when they're added to an email, everyone's like, ooh, okay, time to be our best selves. And you want to invite those people into your podcast. That's really how shows grow, public or private, is you have your core fans that are a fan of you as the host, but then you bring on guests to have new people get introduced to your show. If you don't work in internal communications and you're starting an internal podcast just for your group, you need to lean on your internal communications team and ask for their help. You want to offer up your content to them, offer to make graphics, offer to turn their company newsletter into a podcast for them in exchange for promotion. You really want to be leaning on that internal communications team. If you don't have an internal communications team at your company, whoever works in communications or whoever is doing the company newsletter should be a resource for you. In addition, I mentioned that in most large companies, there are multiple internal podcasts. Don't be afraid to cross-promote between shows and like, hey, you are the host of the marketing show and I'm the host of the accounting show. Let's do a cross-promotion and talk about how our groups can work together and really share what we're working on. And then lastly, most email programs have the ability to have a separate email signature for someone internal versus someone external. For an internal email signature, just add your show, add a link to your show. whatever you're using, whether it's Messy FM or another provider, you're able to link directly to a show or to an episode and put that in your email signature. Hey, check out my latest episode. I used to work in email marketing, and I will tell you that people click those links in email signatures more often than you think. Okay, here's something to screenshot. This is an email template, how to approach an internal guest. So you want to screenshot this. This is the email that you would send someone internally asking them to be a guest on your show. Hello, my name is Name. I host show Name, an internal podcast here at our company about very short description. Then you want to include a really short fact about the show. And then you tell them what you want to interview them about. And then you have some sort of specific compliment for them, why you think that they would be a perfect guest. And then ask if they'll be open to scheduling. It can be that easy, that simple. If you know that this person is short on time, you could also call out, hey, our shows run for 30 minutes and there'll be about a 15-minute setup time. This would require you blocking off less than an hour on your calendar. Okay, we're coming towards the end. This is something else to be screenshotting. This is a 5-day launch plan. So this is the plan that you can go to when you are launching your show internally. Day 1, you're choosing your host and your name. When you are choosing that host, if it's not you and it's executive, think about, okay, whose lunch and learn would sell out first? Who's somebody inside this organization that everyone looks up to? They are often a perfect podcast host. Day 2, you're going to start planning out your season 1 episodes. Remember, think in seasons. You're thinking about 8, 10, maybe 12 episodes. Use employee feedback to guide topics. Don't be afraid to take an informal poll or even a formal poll on Slack or Microsoft Teams. What should we talk about on our internal podcast? Day 3, you're going to record that first episode. You're going to be in a small room, limited windows. Day 4, editing time, as little as you can. At Messy FM, we say it should not take more than 15 minutes to take your finished audio, polish it up, and publish. Edit as little as you can. And day 5, you're going to publish that audio and promote it. So whether you're having people access the podcast through the intranet at your company, you're doing a white labeled app solution, or you have a password, this is the day to promote that. And then over time, after those 5 days have gone on, look at your episodes and see what's getting the most listens. What are people talking to you about in the hall or sending you emails about? Lean into that type of content if you're seeing that people are really responding to particular topics. This is the 5-day launch plan. Messy FM, our software is here to help. Our software is end-to-end. You can record audio, edit that audio, and securely distribute it. We talk to both private workforces and public audiences. So we do have some clients that have shows both publicly and privately available for Messy. Regardless of what your questions are, I am here to help you. This is my email, Messy FM. We're internal podcasting for organizations. You can find us at www.messy.fm. You can always shoot me an email, molly@messy.fm. Thanks so much for listening. So excited to have some questions now.
Thank you very much, Molly, for an amazing presentation. And it's rather rare to listen to a vendor talk about all the other things than the technical stuff. How you're going to use it as an editor or a podcaster or a listener. So I have problems in creating questions for you today.
Great! I'm so excited.
Yeah, but of course there may be one technical issue, and that is how can you imply a platform like audio or like Messy, or for that matter, other type of audio platforms if you already have an intranet or you already have an employee app?
Those are both great questions. So typically, at least in Messy's case, we plug into an existing intranet. So whether you're already running on Okta or you're already doing identity management in Azure or you're like a really Microsoft dedicated company, then Messy comes in and builds on top of your existing intranet solutions, identity management solutions. It's not replacing. Typically, when we work with companies, we're not replacing an existing solution. We're a vendor that plugs into their current workflow. G Suite is really popular. We do a lot of G Suite integrations. So I think right now, at least, in my experience, internal podcasting is new enough that you're not necessarily replacing a system. You're something new that you're offering to your employees. I don't think that will always be the case because it seems like internal podcast is really quite popular right now. But right now, I think for the next probably 12 or 24 months, internal podcasting is a new solution.
Yeah, and that is maybe the last question I have. It is about the trends, because a lot of people have said that we have been in a pandemic, we haven't been able to connect or meet in physical places, and therefore audio has really, really grown because we can be listening to audio in our homes, in where we are working, or spending time with our family, or on the road. But what do you think then about the future? Will then podcast not be that popular, or audio, when the pandemic is over? Or what do you think about the future?
Great. Well, this answer is not biased at all. No, I'm just kidding. So I've been working in podcasting for 6 years, well before this pandemic. My experience, you touched on the fact that I launched Forbes Podcasts. We were talking about that in 2015. We launched in 2016, really grew that platform. My experience was podcasting is just going up, 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 and the trends bear that out. I think that the pandemic in some ways might have accelerated an interest in audio, but audio was already trending up well before the pandemic. And a research that just came out last week that I thought was really interesting is that the number of what they're calling light listeners of podcasts is growing really quickly. Those are people that are listening to between 1 and 3 podcasts a month. That's a sign to me, as someone that cares a lot about audio trends, that we're moving away from people that are just like the early adopters, so dedicated to the medium. And now it's something people can dip into casually. That's really exciting, because what we want as any sort of medium to have staying power is you need those casual listeners, not just the diehards. Long story short, yes, I think the pandemic accelerated audio, but I think we were already on an upwards trend. And I think that we will continue to be on that upwards trend for quite some time.
Is there also here a clue regarding the lower the threshold? Because if people think about podcasting, you think about production, and you see the studios, and you see the equipment that people are using and the time they're using for editing. So maybe we don't only have light listeners, but light producers, or how is that?
Yeah, this is speaking my language. I think ultimately what I'm really passionate about, that not to get too much into my career history, but when I was at Forbes Podcasts, we had the wonderful producers, we had like the really nice equipment, we had all of those things. And I started to get really excited about what would it look like for individual creators that don't have access to all of these things Forbes does? Where's the solution for them? And Messy FM is meant to be that solution for people that don't have access to those things. It's the democratization of audio, and other worthy competitors to Messy FM in the field. We all feel the same way, which is that the same way 15 years ago, if you wrote a blog, you thought you needed like an editor to help you with your blog. Now you just string it up yourselves, you publish it. It's the same thing in podcasting. Like the walls are coming down for this is only for celebrities, and now it's for everyone, which is so exciting. I'm so passionate about people feeling like that they can share their voice, whether that voice is something that goes out to everyone or just on their particular team. A joke I make often that I think is true is that it's very hard to lay off the person that's hosting the internal podcast. Like this is a way for individuals that are looking to stand out at their organization, start an internal podcast, interview not only your boss, but your boss's boss, interview other teams you might want to work on someday. Like this is a way for you to brand yourself. And it's also strong skill set to have, being able to manipulate audio, to think about audio stories. It's not hard. It's just a rare skill right now and something to lean into.
Again, thank you very, very much, Molly. And what I could say maybe is happy podcasting, both for you and for everybody else that will try it out and we hopefully are inspired by your talk here today. So we thank you very much, and good luck.